To get us started, I'm delighted to introduce Senator David Van, Senator for Victoria, Parliament of Australia, to speak on Australia's fuel security and energy resilience.
Thank you very much, Flynn, and I hope you'll all forgive the voice today. As one wag put it, I think I asked too many questions in Senate estimates last week about why we don't have a sovereign fuel production industry here yet. Since being elected to the Senate in 2019, I've devoted all my efforts into two policy areas, and that is energy and national security. Where these two intersect in energy security has long been a passion of mine. Why? Because I don't believe you can have national security without energy security. Historically, our industries, agriculture, homes, hospitals, all once depended on one or more fuel sources to produce other forms of power, e.g. coal to generate electrical power, gas to produce heat, or liquid fuels to drive mechanical power. Now, our energy mix is undergoing a rapid transition while we decarbonise. While how we generate energy is evolving, our reliance on energy is increasing, and the vulnerabilities ensuing from this are growing exponentially. If you then consider the growing number and significance of threats to our energy supply, it is hard not to be a little alarmed, if not a lot. Last year, I chaired a Senate inquiry into energy planning and regulation in Australia, and that tabled its findings just before Christmas. The inquiry found that our transition to a net zero economy is at risk of potential significant setbacks as energy planning is flawed, particularly with regard to having enough clean electricity, and that is generation and storage, enough to replace our carbon-fueled generation. This is significant because if we can't decarbonise our electricity sector, then the other harder to abate sectors will fail to decarbonise, as industrial processes that won't be able to displace carbon fuels through electrification and fuel and feedstock substitutes, such as hydrogen, won't be available. And hydrogen is a clear case in point, as you can't have green hydrogen without green electricity, and the obvious flow-on impacts such as through ammonia and green methanol. And we are already seeing hydrogen hit some significant headwinds with the cancellation of a number of large projects, and this is despite billions of dollars in government support through programs such as Hydrogen Head Start and the recently legislated Future Made in Australia production tax credits. Now, I supported those tax credits through the Senate, but I also fought very hard to have renewable fuels included to have those production tax credits. I put forward an amendment in that legislation to ensure that those tax credits were included, but they were voted against by both the government and opposition, I'm sad to say. And now, don't get me wrong, I fully support a hydrogen industry, and I hope it lives up to the hype of making Australia a hydrogen superpower. However, let's be clear, hydrogen is not central to our national security, and even if it was, the supply chain to deliver it isn't particularly vulnerable. What is vital to our national security and is incredibly vulnerable are liquid fuels, especially diesel and aviation fuel. I'm sure others will provide detailed figures of the fuel use and type by industry, but the one figure that concerns me is that 90% of our liquid fuels, or 80% if I read the Deloitte program yesterday correctly, is imported by sea. Yes, I acknowledge that we've legislated domestic and international obligations to hold reserves. And I think that it's a safe bet there'll be plenty of debate during this conference as to whether we're meeting those obligations or not. Yes, the government have recognised the need to increase storage in particularly in defence. And the 2024 Integrated Investment Plan that accompanied the National Defence Strategy provides for the government to invest between $3.7 and $4.8 billion in improvements to develop and enhance fuel holdings and storage and distribution capabilities for our ADF. However, the problem this enormous investment doesn't address is that you still need to ship that fuel here. The 2023 Defence Strategic Review highlighted, and I quote, "The advantages and vulnerabilities of various international sources of supply and shipping routes of fuel is enormous." In reality, all our shipping routes are vulnerable in this age of geostrategic uncertainty. And yes, you can reroute ships, but as the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea showed us over the last 12 months or so, even a relatively unsophisticated force can cause disruption and impose massive costs and economic shock. And let me be clear, we do not need outright conflict for geopolitical competition to affect our fuel security. Nor does Australia even need to be involved in any conflict to suffer the impacts of any disruption. A mere increase in regional tensions can be enough to induce hesitancy in the mind of shipping companies and most likely their insurers that such a scenario could directly impact Australia's fuel supply chains, especially given that we only have such a minimal buffer, leaving us dangerously exposed to pricing volatility and potential supply shortages. By way of a threat example, just consider the ongoing and escalating tensions between China's Coast Guard and the Philippines Navy at a tiny little feature in the South China Sea called the Second Thomas Shoal. This is an area where the Chinese Coast Guard are using violent tactics to force Philippines Navy off a makeshift garrison, which is quite literally a Philippines naval ship run aground on an atoll, in order to seize and claim that land feature in the South China Sea and continue their land grab in that area. Each new standoff in that space ratchets up the risk of a flashpoint incident that could disrupt our regional trade. We only need to see a Chinese Coast Guard vessel accidentally ram, which they have done, and this time sink a Philippine Navy ship, or some other violent incursion to escalate a broader conflict, which would trigger immediate repercussions for shipping lanes through and around the South China Sea, and especially the nearby choke points, such as the Straits of Malacca, which is where all our fuel is coming through. Yes, the Philippines has a defence treaty with the United States, which one would hope would give the Chinese pause to avoid escalation. But as I wrote my master's last year, China doesn't only have the world's largest navy, which it does, but that is dwarfed by the size of its maritime militia. This is a fleet comprised of hundreds, if not thousands, of commercial ships, transports, ferries, even fishing vessels, most with dual capability, and all under the command of the People's Liberation Army Navy. These ships undertake grey zone tactics, which China has demonstrated is highly capable of conducting hybrid warfare that is utterly effective in meeting its objectives, while avoiding escalation to full conflict. Given that as we said before, over 80% of Australia's fuel is imported, and most arrives via these highly contested sea lanes of communication, any disruption in these crucial waterways could have severe consequences for our energy security. So my question is, why risk it? Why rely on foreign supply sources shipped by non-Australian owned or flagged ships through vulnerable shipping lanes? Why is being reliant on other countries worth the risk? And I would answer, no, it's not. And one only has to look to Ukraine to understand the dangers of foreign dependency. Now, not many of you probably know, but I've been to the front lines of the war in Ukraine, down in Donbass. And I've met the soldiers fighting there who are extremely thankful for foreign weapons, such as the Bushmasters that we supply. But as their defence ministry told me, they would much rather be self-reliant on weapons and other war stocks. And at least they had a reasonable native weapons manufacturing base before the war. We don't have any of that. And I think it's safe to say that the events of the Oval Office this past weekend should serve as a stark reminder to whoever is in government after the next election that we must be striving for self-reliance, particularly in fuel, but also in weapons. And when it comes to fuel security, we must start to build this self-reliance now. And I think this room is part of the answer. Those of you gathered here today are testament to Australia's innate ability to build that self-reliance and produce both sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. We clearly have the technology, we have the skills, we have abundant feedstocks, and that gives us an enormous comparative advantage. And we also have the ability to use what we produce straight away. As I said earlier, I very much support creating a hydrogen industry in Australia, but that is a much harder proposition than building a fuel industry. Hydrogen not only will require massive changes in industry and infrastructure, but there's still an enormous way to go to build the markets that will take the offtake of that production. Renewable fuels already has this ready to go. And I think at the core of this is Australia's lack of a comprehensive energy strategy. Our energy planning in all the various bits of our energy infrastructure is fragmented, reactive, and fails to address the long-term fuel security. If we had an energy strategy that emboldens an agnostic approach to technology, one focused on maintaining energy security, including liquid fuels, while decarbonising our economy, it would show that we need onshore refining capability. And I don't believe that there is significant ideological divide between the two parties, but neither side is seized with the urgency that this important part of our energy mix requires. So, in closing, I ask that whoever wins the upcoming election, I urge them to urgently bring renewable fuel production support to the National Security Committee of Cabinet and start focusing on what's important to Australia, and that's our energy security.